Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to take place in the 18th chapter in the book of Proverbs, and we got a lot to cover, some 24 verses, so what we're going to do today is skip the preamble altogether and just hop right through it. You can type in Corey Johnston Proverbs, and you can read my explanation about the literary device, etc., but we're just going to open with the opening verse, which reads, "The separatist seeks self-desire. He breaks out against all sound wisdom." Now, the separatist, we gather, is selfishly motivated, so they are selfish creatures. Their every action, inclination, and orientation is towards self, and because they are in the cocoon of their selfishness, they reject wisdom when someone tries to correct them or tell them what they need to know. They will not have it. They will reject them and expel them from their presence. And the next verse reads, "A fool does not delight in understanding, but in uncovering his own heart." So the wisdom and understanding and knowledge, the fool has no appetite for it. He has no development. He has never developed these capacities or these inclinations towards anything, any item of wisdom, knowledge, or understanding. But he does delight in expressing. A fool likes to talk just to be heard. They don't really have much to say. And this parallels with, among other proverbs, this is similarly communicated also in Proverbs 12:23. A prudent man concealeth knowledge, but the heart of fools proclaimeth foolishness. So therein we gather that fools would rather talk than listen and learn, because they're largely incapable of learning, but they think they know it all. They want to be the only one heard, and only one. They think they're the only one who has anything to say worth listening to, when objectively, if they could distance themselves from the center of their selfishness, they would realize that they have nothing worth saying, listening to. "When a wicked one comes, scorn comes too, and with shame reproach." A wicked one is followed by scorn. Scorn is rebuke or ridicule. They have ridicule on their tongue, and they also invite rebuke from themselves. So nothing good comes when a wicked one comes. They leave nothing after or behind them that is anything praiseworthy or virtuous. And with shame comes reproach. "The words of a man's mouth are deep waters. The fountain of wisdom is a flowing stream." So this implicitly assumes a wise person, distinct from the fool of whom we have read in the previous passages. They are deep waters. There are many. There is a wisdom and treasury and wells from which we can dig out the vast sums of water, which are likened to knowledge that can be extracted from their words. And wisdom is likened to a flowing stream. That's why the words of the man are implicitly those of the wise man, not just of any man, but a flowing stream. That means that all they have to say is not all they can say. It's just all they have to say at this moment in time. There's a continual, never-ending source or reservoir of knowledge that they have in their head and express from their mouth. So there is the conversation, all that we can learn from a wise person cannot be possibly encapsulated in a single conversation. "It is not good to show partiality to the wicked, or to turn aside the righteous in judgment." This is pretty self-evident. Much of Proverbs are seemingly so self-evident that one often questions to what extent the book belongs in the genre of wisdom literature, but Solomon was able to combine common sense with uncommon insight. So these are very much wise. It goes without saying that we are to be impartial in our judgments, and we should not judge by the exterior, but really hear the case, and not because if we're not careful, if we judge by first appearances or first impressions, we might discard the one who is right and righteous in their cause, and absolve and acquit the wicked and guilty. "A fool's lips enter into strife, and his mouth calls for blows." Therein we learn that the fool's words are contentious and they're quarrelsome, and they invite provocative and reactions and retaliatory words, and his mouth calls for blows, especially when he's surrounded by another fool. A fool listening to another fool will turn violent often when their foolishness counteracts the foolishness in their own head. "A fool's mouth is his ruin, and his lips are the snare of his life." So there's actually a lot of power in the power of words. Words have more than mere meaning. They are powerful. They have the power to uplift. They have the power to heal. They have the power to wound. They have the power to mend. They have the power to offend. The tongue carries within it the power of life and death. And a fool, because their words are foolish as they are, that leads to their own devastation, destruction, and ruin. And if they're not careful, they will sacrifice their life for their own foolish cause. The words of a slanderer are like delicacies, and they go down into the innermost part of the heart. Now, what he's talking about right here are gossip and slanderers. It's alternately translated as gossip, and I think this is easier to assess using the word gossip. So one who gossips has an appetite and inclination for gossip, and they have to constantly feed on more of the same in order to get their fix or fulfillment, but they have to, the only cure for gossip is to fill their minds with the things of God. And I've heard said that first-class minds discuss ideas, second-class minds discuss events, third-rate minds discuss people. So the gossiper, his mind or their mind operates on the lower echelon of substance. So it's easy and tempting to succumb to gossip when it's all around us, but we owe it to ourselves and the ones we surround ourselves with to break through them, to maybe have the courage to say, let's talk about something else, and don't, if necessary, explain why. But it's really, don't be as sounding self-righteous as what I might say might be perceived by one who is gossip, because they reject any righteousness, which is any words that is aligned with the will and character of God. They perceive it as a matter of self-righteousness. So it is a more complicated balancing act, extricating oneself from gossip-oriented conversation. Also, he who is slack in his work is a brother of a master destroyer. So idleness and destruction are two complementary vices, and idleness is not necessarily the absence of activity. It is also activity oriented towards no constructive purpose. We are to make the most of our time and our God-given resources, but that is impossible to do when we are lazy and unconcerned with the kingdom and the work and its spread. This demands diligence, so nothing good. And idleness invites destruction, such as we witness in David in the 11th chapter of First Samuel. He was out on his roof. He wasn't looking for trouble, and it was the spring season, the time when kings went to war. David was a warrior king, yet he stays behind, sends the boys off to the battle. So for all intents and purpose, he was derelict in his duty. Now, most chronologists date the event of that chapter to when he was 50 years old. He might have been past his prime as a fighter, but he still should have been there to give morale and just by his presence and contribute to the battle strategy. But for whatever reason, he wasn't, and he wasn't looking for trouble when trouble found him in the form of Bathsheba bathing within eyesight of his palace, and he invites unforeseen devastation and ruin when he seduces she who had seduced him with his eyes. He committed lust of the eyes, which led to adultery in the heart before he actually committed adultery itself. And one sin leads to another. He impregnates her, and it ultimately leads to him trying to deceive Uriah. And then ultimately, to cover up his sin, he he orders his field and the commander Joab to place him to effectually abandon him to the mercies of the enemy. So therein we witness that what began with idleness leads to untold devastation and ruin, because what resulted from that sin was to tear his family and his kingdom asunder and divide it, at least temporarily. We can read that in the chapters which come after 2 Samuel 11. The name of Yahweh is a strong tower. The righteous run into it and are safe. So the name of Yahweh is the power and the presence of the one to whom it belongs. It is more than merely a name. So that is likened to a strong tower, an impenetrable defense to which the righteous can retreat for refuge and feel safe when the entire world is out to destroy them, out to trip them up, out to make them succumb to its ways and its snares. The righteous can always retreat behind the name of Yahweh as a refuge and as a strong tower through which the darts of the enemy, which are ever present in the world, cannot penetrate or inflict them. The rich man's wealth is his strong city, and like a high wall in his own imagination. Now, Solomon was extraordinarily wealthy. We read in the visitation of him at Gibeon when he's visited in a dream by Elohim, who offers him any wish he can desire, and him being a 19-year-old king, charged with this monumental task of ruling not only any nation, but the nation of the Almighty Covenant Maker and of the Almighty Ruler and Maker of heaven and earth. So he prays for wisdom. Much of what we read in this book and in Ecclesiastes is reflective of his wisdom. We can also read extents of his wisdom in the first Kings and Second Chronicles account, which went behind the building of the temple, among other things, really impressing the Queen of Sheba, and also judging in 1 Kings 3 that judging between the mothers, the prostitutes, in contention for the child. And also we read of the extent of his wisdom. He was a zoologist, a biologist, and the compiler of some 3,000 proverbs. There are only 678 recorded in the book of Proverbs itself. So this isn't the full extent of his wisdom that we read of in here. But because his answer had so satisfied and delighted the one who had asked him, he had offered him essentially a blank slate for any wish he could desire. So pleased him, he gave him that which he did not ask for, which was wealth. And so he had great possessions and amassed possessions, but for the greater part of his life, his possessions did not possess him. So he knew only too well the fleeting and fragile strong city, many trusted riches, but you can't take anything with you when you leave this world behind. And it's the high wall in his own imagination, so it's not at all in the least bit reflective of reality. Riches cannot protect you from hell or death. Before destruction, the heart of a man is haughty, and before esteem is humility. Now, what we have here is what is known as an antithetical juxtaposition. So we have two outlooks and outcomes. The haughty man is proud and essentially a self-exalting creature, and his pride and his self-aggrandizement and self-exaltation leads to his destruction and ruin. But he who humbles himself will be esteemed, and this leads us to the New Testament paradox of which we read of in Matthew 23:12, Luke 14:11, and 18:14. He who humbles himself shall be exalted, and he who exalts himself should be humbled. Or it might actually be presented in the reverse, but in any case, the principle remains parallel and intact. He who answers a matter before he hears it, it is folly and shame to him. Now, that's something I personally am not immune to. Oftentimes, I say what I say before thinking about what I say, and this is not a settled or fixed habit. It's not my default state of mind, but it's something I recognize in myself upon reading this. But the fool is more or less hopeless. They cannot control themselves. They like to talk without listening and talk without thinking. And that is folly and shame. That is self-evident connected to it. The connection to it is self-evident. The spirit of a man sustains him in sickness, but who can bear a broken spirit? So we're gathering the two types of sickness. One, physical maladies, which visit the flesh and the body and the physical frame of a man, but the strength of a spirit can sustain and not cure, but guide one through the sickness and not let it get the best of him. But there's a spiritual sickness of a broken spirit, which there are no known cures for, we can gather and imagine. The heart of the understanding one gets knowledge, and the ear of the wise seeks knowledge. So those who are understanding and inclined towards knowledge and wisdom, they will seek after that which most satisfies and delights them. Wisdom has an addictive quality that you're not content to settle on one nugget of wisdom, but inevitably reach out for the next and the next and the next. But there are no side effects, no hangover or come downs from the addictive pursuit of wisdom. A man's gift makes room for him and brings him before great men. This is simple and self-evident. Anyone who brings gifts will invite himself into, will be invited for others, and they will open doors to him before men of prominence and positions of authority. The first to state his own case is right until another comes along and examines him. So what we often witness is that if you're flipping for a coin in a court of law or in an argument, the most strategic location is to make your response come second, because he who comes after he who leads in the argument will have the advantage of shaping their response in accordance to what is said before them. So oftentimes we're so convinced and so compelled by the opening argument that we are not persuaded until the next one comes around. The lot settles disputes and separates between the mighty. Now, lots were not, strictly speaking, divinely oriented means of settling disputes or controversies, although we do often witness that Yahweh does use this largely pagan practice, such as we witness on the boat, which is borderline subsumed by the storm, which Jonah is trying to escape. He has the pagan sailors on it cast lots, and it points to Jonah, and he reveals that he is fleeing from he is a Hebrew, and he worships the Almighty Maker of heaven and earth, whom he is fleeing from. And we also witness this in the first chapter of the Acts of Apostles, when they cast lots between two men to select Judas's designated replacement as the apostles. It ends up landing on Matthias, whom we don't read anything after the fact, but we do know from history that he died a martyr in Cappadocia, I believe it was, in Italy. So even though Paul, for all intents and purposes, was Judas's replacement, the original selection was, in fact, Matthias, according to them. A brother transgressed against it is a strong city. A brother transgressed against is a strong city, and contentions are like the bars of a citadel. So within every friendship, friendships are delicate to maintain, and when we offend a friend, it's often difficult to mend and reconcile and mend it all together. So there's often, it takes a little bit, goes a long way. The unkind word spoken at an inopportune moment can have a devastating ripple effect, which can potentially contaminate a friendship. And contentions are more often between acrimonious antagonists, but they can exist between former friends and ultimately ruin that friendship. A man's stomach is satisfied from the fruit of his mouth. He is satisfied by the increase of his lips. So this is speaking of physical stomach is satisfied by the food which goes into his mouth and is ingested and absorbed and digested by the stomach, and but it's also speaking of satisfaction from the increase of one's lips, which means accelerated and intense talking and babbling, essentially. So this man, we can accurately surmise, is a man of neither virtuous nor viceful potential. It's more or less a universal description for man, no matter what character they are. Death and life are in the power of the tongue, and those loving it eat its fruit. So once more we read that there are more than words have more than mere meanings. They have power, the power of death and life itself. Many the words that we speak often lead to wars. Human history in intemperate language has contributed to wars between nations, and so that leads to death, but they can also contrarianly lead to life. And but those who love the words will eat its fruit. They will absorb it and digest it and seek after it and be fulfilled, and their appetite will be satisfied by eating the fruit it offers. Now the wicked will naturally be inclined to gravitate towards the idle words, idle chatter, and gossip, and slander, and innuendo, etc., whereas the righteous one will be gravitate towards the words of wisdom, which uplifts, edifies, and heals, and fixes things. He who has found a wife has found good, and receives grace from Yahweh. So families were likened to divine blessings in the ancient world, and the problem with Solomon is he had more than one wife. He had, by the tail end in 1 Kings 11, we read that he had gathered some 700 wives and 300 concubines, and these wives would be his ruin, because what happened is he loved them, we read, and he had a permissive and lax attitude towards their idolatrous practice. He essentially allowed them to set up shop in the palace itself and in Jerusalem all around them, thus contaminating the spiritual integrity of the covenant nation. So, but he also, we read in Song of Solomon, the apple of his eye, when he attributed to his youthful years when he found a wife he truly loved, and he considered that a blessing and grace. The poor speaks beseechingly, but the rich answers fiercely. This is the luxury that the rich have. They are able to be more provocative and offensive and say they're at more liberty to speak what their socioeconomic status entails, but the poor does not have such a luxury. They have to posture and persuade and be more convincing and just deferential than the rich are in fact allowed to. A man of friends might come to ruin, but there is a loving one who sticks closer than a brother. So friends of human nature, they can deceive us, they can betray us, but there is a loving one that's capitalized, so that indicates divinity, who sticks closer than a brother. So even though all our friends and family may abandon us, we are never abandoned or alone when we belong to him. He is a very real friend and present help in times of need. He will not betray us like friends can. We can betray him, and he will respond accordingly, perhaps at the judgment, or he may rebuke us if we get out of line while we are determined to walk on the straight and narrow, such as we witnessed with David earlier. But that's all the verses in this chapter. That's all the time we have for today. In retrospect, I could have given a preamble, but that wasn't a risk I was willing to take. No regrets. This one, I'm going to keep it and maybe share it. So that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you're here. Stay tuned until next time. See you then. Bye-bye.